Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Pat Garofalo, and I'm Director of State and Local Policy at the American Economic Liberties Project. We're so psyched to have you here today for the final of 3 workshops we're hosting this week on how state and local leaders can challenge corporate power. If you're back after one of the previous sessions, hello again, and thanks for being here. If this is the first one you're catching, welcome. We're really psyched that you decided to tune in. You can watch the previous 2 sessions over on our YouTube channel if you didn't catch them earlier this week. You'll learn about antitrust reform with special guest Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, and learn about taking on the corporate subsidy machine with special guest Illinois Representative Bob Morgan. But today, we're going to be discussing big tech and what states and cities can do to rein in its most abusive practices. In recent years, there's been a significant interest across the country in state capitals and state AG offices in addressing the economic power of big tech, which has generated a whole slew of new exciting legislation, which my colleague Lee Hepner and I will walk you through in just a little bit. Everything we'll talk about is in our new toolkit, Tools for Taking on Big Tech's Economic Power, which is available on our website. Download it, check it out. You can follow along with all of the things we're talking about today. We're hoping to get some good discussion going during that portion of the program, so please ask questions if you have them via the YouTube chat. But before we get to all that, it is our great honor to be hosting New York Assemblymember Anna Kellis today. Assemblymember Kellis is one of the foremost champions in state government for challenging big tech's power, standing up for workers, local businesses, and communities. She's a co-sponsor of the 21st Century Antitrust Act, which is a truly groundbreaking piece of legislation, as well as the sponsor of a bill to stop Apple and Google from abusing their App Store monopolies. These are measures that would make hugely positive change for New York State were they enacted into law. We're so glad to have her here today to discuss this important issue with you all. Assemblymember Kellis, over to you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, and it's so wonderful to be here. I wrote notes for myself to keep me on track, but you'll see me looking at those. But this is a topic near and dear to my heart, and 10 minutes is not enough to get it started. I could probably sit here for 7 hours. So anyone who wants to follow up, you'll definitely know where to find me, obviously. But I wanted to start off talking about why I care so much about this and why I think it's such an important thing for legislators to focus on, which is just the concept of antitrust laws in general, why they're so important. We talk about the different types of economies throughout the entire country. We have a capitalist system, but a capitalist system depends completely, the definition of it really is a robust competitive system, competitive markets. And the breakdown of the antitrust systems. Well, and originally the creation of the antitrust laws were to safeguard the economy from monopolies to ensure a robust competition. So we have seen that breakdown of the antitrust laws over time that has allowed for the consolidation of wealth and power, which is in and of itself a positive feedback loop. So I just wanted to touch on a few things that are really important, a tiny window into the history of action corporations have taken to maximize profits through the minimization of competition. So the first was really the gutting of the antitrust laws. But there are seeds throughout that they intentionally hide, but that have massive impacts. For example, we very rarely read the ridiculously long contract that we sign with Verizon, or that we sign with when we sign up for a Google account. We actually are agreeing to a very long contract. And in all of these contracts, it is now standard practice by all major corporations and the tech corporations to include forced arbitrations. That was sort of one of the first big movements they made. And then the second is the prevention of class action suits. A third is that if the corporations win the case, that the individual customer pays their legal fees. These are things that we sign onto and sign away in those contracts. Forced arbitration is really important. It was the mechanism that corporations used to bypass the judicial system. By forcing the use of arbitration instead. And very often, of course, the arbitrators are funded by the very corporations. And I think it's something like 75% or larger, last time I looked, of cases are won by the corporations. So that's one huge thing. Obviously, the punchline being read the fine print. But the problem with monopolies in this tech world is that you don't really have an alternate, or you have very few alternates, but they're not as competitive. They don't have the resources, so they don't have the service that is as high a quality. So it's very hard to switch off, and the only way you can use that resource is if you sign these, these very long signing your rights away. Of course, everybody's familiar with Citizens United, and that was the attempt to further gain a stronghold on policymakers to ensure that the legislation that we pass is in their favor. That is, one of the foundational issues that makes our work that much harder for us, but why this is also incredibly important. As Pat mentioned, one of the bills that I'm carrying is to prevent tech companies like, say, Google, Amazon, and Apple are just some examples, from preventing creators of apps from selling their apps on any other platform except for theirs. So they gain an exclusive right. And then because they've signed away that exclusive right, they also can take a share as a fee of the profits of that company. And what we've seen is that they are up to and even exceeding 30% of the profits for the creator of that app. So they're taking their creativity, their ingenuity, and taking the profit without having to do any of that back work. So the bill that I am carrying in the New York State Assembly, A6526, would make that illegal. And anyone who's following this case knows that there are actually several federal cases, state cases, that are addressing this, looking at this on whether or not this is illegal. But what is very important about the state legislation is that even the fact that the legislation exists in the state forces a conversation and also puts pressure on the federal government, where this, the ideal is that it would take place there, that the passing of this type of legislation would take place federally. It forces the conversation at the federal level, particularly when the legislation is brought forward and is working its way through the the two houses. That puts pressure on the federal government. If it passes in states, particularly if they are states with really high budgets, that can also force a conversation at the federal level, because it's a way that we're saying, not only can they lean back on us and say we have a very large population that has already agreed to this action, but on the other flip side, it's saying we're getting a lot of pressure from this very large amount of people who have already agreed that this is the direction that they want us to go. So you can look at it from both directions, but that's why they're so powerful. And that is sort of the foundation of what we're talking about here today. But I wanted to get into a couple other topics that I think are really important and foundational in this topic of why it's so important to create balance and power with corporations. Monopolies dominate markets and set terms, as I mentioned earlier, and so their focus really is to kill off any competition, because then, of course, they can control the supply, and if they control the supply, then they set the terms, because customers don't have alternate choices, as I said earlier. So some really great examples are the practices that were all over the news with respect to what Uber was doing. And one of the things that was less talked about Uber prices is that they had a practice specifically with their app of going into cities. When they entered into a new city, they would research the prices that other competitors were setting, including taxi drivers, would create a price structure below, or the cost for those Ubers below the cost for any of those competitors. And basically, because they were so powerful and they had so much money, they could take a temporary loss in profits by doing that, because they could make it up in other places because they already have a monopoly and because they're so huge, wait for their competitors to die out because they can't compete anymore. And then once they're the only providers, they would skyrocket the prices per mile, the cost for trips. That's one example. Strong antitrust laws would prevent mergers like, here's another example, like the merger between Aetna and CVS, if anybody is familiar with that. And this one is near and dear to my heart, although it isn't tech specific. But I want particularly all the legislators on the call to understand how invasive this is, and how much it can affect even the smallest entities in your community. Of course, CVS has online platforms, online access, but to merge a CVS which sells drugs and Aetna that determines the reimbursement rates for those medications, you can see how there is a serious conflict of interest. How it plays out in municipalities, I'll give you an example because it happened in my municipality here in Ithaca. We had Green Street Pharmacy. It was the only remaining independent pharmacy, which, if you do the research, there has been a phenomenal fast rate die out of independent pharmacies because of consolidation, mergers and acquisitions within this arena. The independent pharmacy was the only one willing to sell medications or even carry medications related to helping with substance use disorders, because pharmacies lose money with those because they don't get reimbursed even for the cost of providing it. But they were so committed to the community that they provided it anyway. None of the other chains would even provide it because their priority was the cost and making profits. And of course, that is their requirement, because if a corporation is not maximizing its profits and they're doing actions that actually intentionally impact or reduce their profits, they can be held legally accountable and sued by their shareholders. So, understanding that structure, unless it's a B corporation, and that's another whole conversation. But what ended up happening is not only they were losing money, the independent pharmacy was losing money there, but the pharmacist showed me a breakdown of the reimbursement rates that the chains were getting per drug, per pharmaceutical, compared to what the independent was getting. And because the independent didn't have the economies of scale and the power to negotiate larger reimbursements, they were getting sometimes 25% of what the chains were getting, and they simply couldn't make it anymore. And the last independent pharmacy in the entire region of the state just closed because of that. So that just gives a sense of they can wait them out, and that's it's important to know how that impacts out the workforce in our municipalities, and why this work that we're doing is so important. Another one, of course, is understanding the business models for corporations and its impact on the workforce itself. So again, if a corporation, a C or S corporation's a legal responsibility is to maximize their profits, then they will prioritize reducing the cost of all of the main items in their budget. And most businesses will have their main budget expense is the personnel line. So there has been a systematic deterioration of benefits and wages for the workforce in the United States. And there was an amazing graph that I found at one point, data that I found that showed, starting in about 1974, the incomes of pretty much all of us, except for C-suite executives and passive earners, has been flat since 1974. The C-suite executives, their wages, salaries have been increasing steadily. What was fascinating is that there was an explosion way above the wealth increase of the C-suite, and that was the passive earners, the shareholders. So you could see, even though GDP was increasing, so we were increasing in efficiency, we were getting more out of the workers, but we were giving them less. And the only way that that's possible is if you have an inordinate, disproportionate amount of power compared to the workforce. The one way, of course, you can maintain that is union busting. And we see that, of course, constantly. And the only time we've seen any backlash of that is during COVID in the last 40 years. Perfect example here, we have Starbucks. It was the first city, I think it was the first city that all of the Starbucks fully unionized. And within 2 months of all of them unionizing, all the Starbucks were closed for at least half the day, which is a way of saying, fine, we're not going to fire you. We're not going to take that media hit. We'll just reduce our hours. We'll say it's because of COVID, which, of course, this happened just in the last 6 months. So to say that it's COVID related is unrealistic. But it made it that much harder for the workers to stay because they couldn't make enough money if the store hours were cut in half. So that is a classic union busting move, because major monopolies, corporations, can afford to take a hit and have loss of profit in certain areas if they can make it up in other areas. And that way they can maintain their power. So, something that I've learned why the focus on small businesses and really supporting the local economy is so incredibly important is because profits leave local municipalities at hyperspeed when the money sales are happening at the large scale corporate franchises. In comparison, money circulates around the local economy about 14 times longer when it's been invested in local businesses over the large corporate businesses. We do see examples. We have one example here of a tech business, Rosie's, that was an online app for getting groceries, identifying them and getting them sent to you. Everybody's very familiar with Instacart. This came around before then. The thing that Rosie's does that's unique is that they don't put their own name forward. They give their app to, or they partner with stores, and then the stores use their name as the app. So, right, we have Green Star, and it's the Green Star app, not Rosie's app, but it says run by Rosie's on the bottom. So it was a way of giving sort of this unique front end app for stores, but they could not compete with Instacart, and just 2 weeks ago were bought out by Instacart. Very occasionally the corporation will keep the business where it is and keep a majority of the staff, but very often, of course, eventually you will see cuts in personnel and priority focus on efficiency. So some of the legislation that has been introduced in New York State, I wanted to just shift to talk a bit about what we're doing here in New York State. Very briefly, Pat mentioned the 21st Century Antitrust Act, and this makes it illegal to create monopolies in New York State. And what's really important is that the legislation specifically outlines what the criteria of a monopoly would look like, and what actions of abuse or conduct of abuse when there is a monopoly, what that would look like. So it very clearly defines how to identify a monopoly, and the bill very explicitly outlines what role the Attorney General would play in upholding and prosecuting when there is actions that are monopolistic in the state. So that one is revolutionary, hugely important. That's the one that I am the co-sponsor for and champion for. There's another one which is banning non-disclosure agreements. And some of you may be familiar with some of the actions by large e-commerce companies like Amazon that is always looking for places to build warehouses. But last year, I think the report was that Amazon paid no taxes, or a net zero taxes, if I recall. And how they do that is by going into communities, and there is a practice through municipalities of giving tax breaks to large corporations like this to attract them to the municipality in the hopes that it'll bring some money into the economy and hopefully some jobs. And what these companies will do is they will go into the community and they'll say, well, we're interested in talking to you, but before we're willing to talk to you at all, you all have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And sometimes they can be really aggressive, spreading out into the community to non-elected officials. But typically it's a non-disclosure agreement with officials, which means that they cannot talk to the public. So it is completely secret. And banning NDAs would prevent that practice. So all of it would need to be public, so that the municipality could both educate themselves and give feedback into the process, and also, of course, organize if it is something that the community does not think they will benefit from. If there's an NDA, then by the time the contract is ready to sign, there's not enough time left for the community to really engage in the process. So it is a way that the large corporations can both get the contract they're looking for, that works to their best advantage, but also minimizes any negative press, which of course no corporation wants. Another one that we are carrying, and that bill, by the way, is A9092, if anybody's interested in looking at it. There's also banning the use of tax subsidies for e-commerce warehouses to attract them to specific taxing jurisdictions. So we all have industrial development agencies, and their purpose is to create economic development. But if you look at the original intent of IDAs, it is to create economic development with a primary focus on job creation, because it is not just bringing money into the community that will turn right back around and leave the community, because the profits all go to a corporation that doesn't have a headquarters in your community, but to create economic development by creating good jobs and creating a strong middle class. And they talk about that historically as a great measure of a robust economy. And that is not what you get with these large e-commerce warehouses. Consistently, what is found is significant union busting, preventing any strong, fair wages, significantly fewer jobs than they promise, very consistently, and the benefit really going to the corporation and not the local community. But even worse, of course, it can affect other smaller local businesses in the community. So this is a bill that bans the tax subsidy, the use of the tax subsidy that is under the IDA purview, specifically to attract these e-commerce warehouses. And that bill is A9636. And I just wanted to mention one last bill that I am carrying that I do think is really important. I've seen it introduced now in several other states, which is very exciting. And a bill has been introduced now in the federal level. And this is the Sustainability and Social Accountability Fashion Act. And the reason I bring it up and why it's so important is because we are saying in New York State with this bill that any fashion brand over a certain size, $100 million in gross, global gross, that they have to adhere to certain regulations. The fashion industry has almost zero regulations. It's a global industry. It's phenomenally consolidated. They have very little oversight over their labor practices or their environmental practices. This would require that they map out their supply chain at least 50% and prioritize the high-risk areas, map out their baseline impacts on environmental things like greenhouse gas emissions and water quality, and map out their labor practices, identifying risks of forced labor, child labor, stolen wages, And once they've identified that baseline, they are held accountable to continuously improve on those measures over time. And the AG is empowered to hold them accountable. And if they don't show substantial, notable change over time of reducing their risk of negatively affecting the environment and labor, they can be fined up to 2% of their gross income. So I bring this up because we are in a global economy now. These entire industries like fashion have massive impacts on climate change, which is going to affect the quality of life of all of us. The fashion industry is responsible for up to 8% of all greenhouse gases on the planet. And anybody who's studied the environment knows how close we're getting to some very significant tipping points of no return, which will impact all of us. And the fast fashion, e-commerce fast fashion industry creates more thrown away clothing that has never been worn than anybody here probably could ever estimate or imagine, way beyond what anyone would imagine. Clothes never worn. Millions and millions of pounds of clothes, simply because it's not worth finding a home for them, a new way to sell them, when the fashion trends shift away from the clothes that have been made. And since they have been made so cheaply, because they've held all wages to pennies in other countries, the impact, obviously, to all of us is phenomenal. So those are some of the pieces of legislation that we are doing here in New York State to try and even the playing field. And these, obviously, monopolistic behaviors have skyrocketed in the tech world. So to get these pieces of legislation, introduced and passed in states is so incredibly important right now for I think every single state, so that we can put the pressure on the federal government to do its job in then taking this to the federal level. So I will stop there. That was a very long, comprehensive summary, but hopefully I hit all the major talking points.
That was so great. Thank you so much, Assemblymember Kellis, for being here, for hitting all the high notes, and I think explaining really well how this affects the community. And actually, if you have time for one question, I would love to ask you. You gave a really good example of a local company that was harmed by bad merger policy. So in the 21st Century Antitrust Act, there's two really important parts. One, much stronger powers to police antitrust violations on the labor side, so harming workers through your corporate power, and then merger review for the AG, so that the AG would have the ability to come in and say, actually, this merger will be bad for New York State, and therefore it cannot go ahead. What would it mean for your kind of local tech businesses, entrepreneurs, innovators to have those kind of measures in law in New York State?
Well, it's phenomenally important because the large corporations always use economies of scale so that they can undercut pricing for any of the local entrepreneurs. And what's very frustrating about it is because the local entrepreneurs are spending all the money to develop, right? They're doing all the R&D with all the staff, and the large corporations, can swallow that up and just, undercut them until they can outcompete them and then buy them up. So the idea, the hope is that this type of legislation would allow for an equal footing between the large corporations and the smaller corporations, and it really gives that support and uplifting for the smaller corporations by essentially a slap on the hand, saying, yeah, no, that behavior of destroying all your competitors so you can control the supply and all of the terms of engagement, we're no longer allowing in the state. So I think it's particularly important in my area because we have a lot of A lot of really brilliant entrepreneurs coming out of the universities here, both Cornell and even IC, SUNY Cortland, TC3, amazing collaborations between the universities, and the focus right now is to just survive in the world of the large corporations, and the only way they can do that is to move to Silicon Valley or New York City, or like 3 places. So we have this brain drain out of this area, and that is what happens throughout the entire country. That it really destabilizes. They come here, they learn here, they build small here, they figure out, they work, they create temporarily create amazing jobs, and then we lose them immediately, and it destabilizes all of the smaller economies, all the smaller municipalities. So we're experiencing that tremendously and are trying to counter some of that.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you being here today. So many great things happening in New York, and Assemblymember Kellis is one of the great champions leading the fight. Again, really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely, my pleasure. My pleasure. Happy to be here. I'll see you on the legislative fight side.
That sounds great. So I feel like maybe Lee and I should just not say anything, because Assemblymember Kellis did such a great job. We should just end the show now and sign off, but we're not going to do that. My colleague Lee Hepner, our legal counsel here at the American Economic Liberties Project, and I are going to walk through 8 policy ideas that state and local lawmakers can use to rein in big tech. I'm going to do the first few, then I'm going to hand it over to Lee for a little bit, and then we'll wrap it up at the end. And the first one, for anyone who listened to Assemblymember Kellis, should be very familiar. It is to regulate App Store dominance to help small and mid-sized businesses. And I'll say again, all of these policy ideas are in the toolkit that we put out this week. It's available on our website if you want to grab it and follow along. You can see model legislation there, bills across the country that we like and have been impressed by. And Assemblymember Kellis said it perfectly in explaining this. There's a duopoly. Apple and Google have pretty much complete control over getting apps in front of customers. And they use that control to slam certain developers with extremely high fees. And I say certain very deliberately, because that's going to be an important point. They use their control, this gatekeeping power over the app distribution, to charge developers first for a license to be in the App Store. That they charge everybody. It's something like $100 a year. Everybody pays it. That's fine. Then certain developers whose products only work on mobile phones, so something like a fitness app, right, that needs to be in your pocket and carried around, or else it doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make sense to have it on a desktop that sits on your desk. They charge those developers from 15 to 30% extra on every single subscription. So every time someone makes a payment or subscribes to one of those apps, 15 to 30% goes to not the developer, not the people who created it, not the workers who are toiling away to make it happen, but to Apple and Google, merely for setting up the marketplace and merely for having this access to the consumer, because they control the entire mobile market. The bill that Assemblymember Kellis sponsors in New York, there are versions of it all across the country, in Arizona, in Illinois, in Massachusetts. There was one in Florida. There was one in Louisiana. Would prevent this practice, would say this is not okay. It would allow those developers to use alternative systems to collect payments, therefore ensuring that they don't have to turn over automatically 15 to 30% every time to Apple and Google. We think this would be a huge deal. And we actually talk to developers all the time who say this would be a game changer, but they are almost never willing to go public because there's a ton of fear in this industry. They're so scared of Apple and Google, because it's their sole means of accessing the consumer, retaliating, lowering them in search results, barring them from the App Store completely, holding up their application for changes in their apps, and say they don't want to talk about this extremely real problem in the app economy. But it is very real. It's there, and bills like Assemblymember Kellis's and those all across the country would do something about it. We think it's a great idea. Number 2 of our 8 ideas for reining in big tech's power is to adopt common carrier rules to stop big tech's self-preferencing. One of the big problems with tech firms is that they both own platforms, things like Google, like Amazon, but then also compete on them. So think Amazon Basics, Amazon selling products on its platform while also selling similar products from third-party sellers, or Google showing Google products in search results. So you type in looking for something and up pops a Google product. Google and Amazon both boost their own products above their competitors, even if their competitors are better. There have actually been studies that have shown that users on Google, when they're doing Google searches, prefer searches that don't pop up with Google's own products, such as Google Maps or Google Shopping. They like it better when the Google algorithm shows them what it would naturally produce instead of force feeding them Google products. So Google is actually actively degrading its own chief product, its search engine, in order to promote its own other lines of businesses. Why would it do that? Because it keeps you within the Google ecosystem. Therefore, Google can show you more ads. Therefore, Google can make more money, even if your experience as a user is worse. And actually, here's a kind of startling stat. As of 2019, fewer than half of searches that originate on Google result in a click away from Google. Common carrier rules for digital platforms were recommended in a report by the House Antitrust Subcommittee, as well as in a lawsuit against Google filed by Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost. The US has a long history of imposing such rules on things like railroads or banks, telephone networks, television networks, to ensure that vital avenues of commerce cannot be co-opted to benefit one particular corporation's products. Most states have broad powers to designate certain corporations as public utilities or common carriers, and we think that's a great idea and should move forward. And then the last one for me for a minute before I turn it over to Lee, and Assemblymember Kelles got into this a bunch and should just probably go listen to what she said rather than listening to me talk about it, is to stop subsidizing big tech's expansion. Amazon alone has received more than $4 billion in state and local subsidies, most of which helped it build out its warehousing and distribution network, which allows it to harm local retailers and force them to pay fees to access that very network. Google and Facebook have both received hundreds of millions of public dollars to build data centers, which are the very necessary infrastructure those corporations need to exist at all. Their businesses don't make sense without having that infrastructure. And Apple received $850 million in public funds for a single research and development site in North Carolina. This is money flowing to some of the biggest, most powerful tech companies on the planet, and therefore actively entrenching their dominance over any sort of local competitor, giving them funds to, like Assemblymember Kellis talked about, go out and just gobble up all the little would-be competitors before they can really take off. So we think it's really important to stop subsidizing big tech's expansion. If you want to learn even more about corporate subsidy policy, you can go back on our YouTube channel and watch yesterday's workshop, Tools for Taking on the Corporate Subsidy Machine, with Illinois Representative Bob Morgan. We go really, really deep on this subject, not just with big tech, but with corporations all across the economy. And with that, I'm going to turn it over for a little while to Lee to walk through some other really, really important stuff.
All right. Thanks so much, Pat. And thanks again to Assemblymember Kellis. That really was spectacular. And you'll hear me invoke things that she mentioned throughout her talk and some of the bills that New York is pushing, really leading on some of these policies. The first idea that I want to put out there is adopting an abusive dominance standard. This is something that a few states have taken on, and it's really kind of changing the game. But I'll explain too why it's not reinventing the wheel. It's kind of more like putting the wheel back in motion after a long period of neglect in antitrust enforcement and regulation. What is the abusive dominance standard? Well, I think that really kind of, again, requires going back about a half century. If you familiarized yourself with antitrust law in the past, one of the first concepts you'll learn about is the consumer welfare standard of antitrust law. This theory of antitrust essentially says that monopolies are anti-competitive really only when they raise prices above competitive levels. In another way of saying that if the consumer is paying a lower price, then we can gloss over the rest of the harms that are caused by concentrated corporations. But by placing that emphasis on direct benefits to the end consumer, what we've done effectively over the past several decades is foregone all of the other ways that corporate concentration can crush small businesses, harm workers, and really upend entire communities, as we've seen across the country. So in that context, the abusive dominance standard broadens the envelope of harms that we tend to associate with corporate concentration. Again, this is nothing new. These concepts have been in the public consciousness for as long as monopolies and dominant corporations have been around. They've just been eroded by courts and a really effective campaign, effectively, to advance a monopoly-friendly economic theory. Assemblymember Kellis, you talked about a really good example of what an abusive dominance might look like, and that's predatory pricing. Assemblymember Kellis talked about when rideshare companies came into communities and offered prices that were so far below taxis because they could afford to do so. And in doing so, effectively drove out that competition, or at least made it extremely hard for taxis to compete, really kind of cratering the competition while gobbling up that market share. I think a lot of us have experienced more recently that now that companies like Uber and Lyft have that market share, they are now raising prices on consumers. So that predatory pricing upfront to drive out competition, amass market share, and then you recoup those losses later on by raising prices on the consumer. That's an example of predatory pricing. Uber was actually sued at one point by a company called Sidecar, which I don't think is around anymore, for exactly this practice. And Uber settled that case some years ago. But predatory pricing is a good example of an abuse of dominance. The other things that we've talked about already, self-preferencing, like when Amazon ranks its own products higher in search results than some of the small vendors who are trying to sell on Amazon. So if you control the store, you can also control and self-preference your own products under existing law. An abuse of dominance standard would take care of that. Some folks may know that there's movement on that at the federal level as well. We're trying to make this policy the law of the land at the state level and make sure that there's a bottom-up version of that approach. Other really good examples, monopoly leveraging, tying, and bundling. This is when Amazon requires retailers to use their fulfilled by Amazon service for the delivery of products, driving out alternatives that might actually be cheaper for retailers and more accessible for retailers. Oh boy, there's going to be some construction out my window. Again, I want to point folks to the leadership of Senator Gianaris, Assemblymember Kellis in New York. The 21st Century Antitrust Act is a really good example of abuse of dominance legislation that we would encourage folks to take a look at and reach out to us for how to do it in your own communities. The next idea that I want to put out there is relates to the food delivery app economy. This is an issue that is near and dear to me. I was a legislative staffer in San Francisco, where Uber and Postmates and DoorDash are all headquartered. Back in 2019, we started looking into reports that restaurants were being crushed by delivery fees as high as 30% of each order. We asked around to restaurants in our communities and actually learned that they were being abused in many other ways. For instance, as they were being charged 30% per order, they were also being prohibited from setting their own in-app menu prices. That means that that they were being charged 30% and then prohibited from recouping any of that loss from the consumer. This also signaled to us that food delivery apps were effectively competing directly with the dine-in experience. And with the rise of ghost kitchens and cloud kitchens, perhaps they weren't even interested in maintaining or upholding the restaurant industry as we know it, but were in fact more interested in becoming sort of everything apps and everything markets. Of course, as we all experienced and anticipated, pandemic hit. Food delivery apps really exploded. Cities, including San Francisco, many others across the country, introduced emergency caps at 15%. Many of those included provisions to allow restaurants to set their own in-app menu prices. This is legislation that's got a lot of precedent, a lot of bottom-up support from the restaurant community. It's also a really good story about worker harm, and there's a really strong labor movement around dignity in the workplace for gig workers. So this is an issue that's ripe to take on today. Now that Uber has acquired Postmates, DoorDash acquired Caviar, just 3 companies control 97% of this market. I think it's going to be really interesting to see where this goes. I have a theory that I think is I think logical, that a lot of these companies are more interested in becoming online advertising companies and really kind of jumping to that sort of Amazon level everything store. And I think you see this now, that restaurants are being asked to pay extra fees for in-app search optimization. They're essentially now being sold a digital storefront akin to a corner lot on a commercial corridor. So how do regulators really want to protect restaurants from feeling like they are forced to pay even more of those slim margins for digital ad space? And I think the answer to that, or one answer to that, is to cap the fees that they can charge to restaurants, and in the same breath, address some of the other predatory practices that we've seen. I'd be remiss not to mention the research and writing of our senior fellow, Mo Kasich, who is a real national thought leader on this issue. And we'd be happy to help you design a piece of legislation and work with you to understand where the gaps are in your community that we can help close for the sake of small businesses, workers, neighborhood commercial corridors, you name it. The last idea that I'll discuss before throwing it back to Pat is right to repair laws. As with food delivery app regulation, right to repair laws have found a lot of success in state legislatures in just the past 2 to 3 years. Over half of state legislatures across the country have introduced some form of right to repair law to give consumers the right to repair their own consumer goods. We tend to think of this in terms of tech consumer goods, which might be a figment of who turns out to oppose these types of laws. It tends to be the big tech corporations, but there's actually been as much movement in the context of agricultural tools, medical equipment, automobiles. And indeed, as a lot of our consumer goods, the appliances that we have in our homes become integrated with technology, the boundary between what is a big tech device or what is a consumer electronic good and what has traditionally been, a less technologically advanced or integrated or networked appliance in your home tends to blur. And that's a challenge with defining big tech. A good illustration of this, John Deere tractors had actually started putting software into their tractors and entered into end user license agreements with farmers, prohibiting them from repairing their tractors. So you see a lot of laws now in Arkansas, in Florida, in my colleague Pat's favorite state of New Jersey. You actually have right to repair laws focused solely on agricultural equipment. In California, you have SB 605, which is a medical device right to repair law. California did attempt to pass a right to repair law for consumer electronic goods this year. That died in committee amid pushback from tech companies. But we have a better example out there. And actually, Assemblymember Kellis was the co-sponsor of a bill in New York that is pending signature of Governor Hochul, the first right to repair law for consumer electronic goods. Tech companies have made it really hard, really challenging to access manuals, read error logs, run diagnostic tests on consumer electronic goods. This allows them to control the market of affiliated repair providers. And that in that respect, a law like New York's law is actually a small business bill that also helps independent repair providers get access to the documents and the tools and the diagnostic tests to do that repair. It gives consumers the right to access those tools as well, albeit on fair and reasonable terms. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. There's also a very interesting and relevant environmental component to right to repair laws. E-waste has become the world's fastest growing domestic waste stream, fueled by high consumption, short product life cycles, and very few options for repair, as we've talked about. So right to repair laws have emerged as a response to the environmental consequences of big tech dominance, with legislation aimed at, again, allowing consumers to repair their top technology before just throwing it out prior to its useful life cycle. At the end of the day, this exclusivity and this control that big tech is able to exert over repair drives up costs for consumers. It inhibits small business and innovative small business community growth. And the FTC has really called out that piece of it, remarking that corporate repair restrictions have steered consumers into manufacturers' repair networks, driving down local repair businesses that may be even cheaper for consumers and allow them to hang on to those goods for even longer. So the solution, again, much more simple than the problem, which I think is a vast and fascinating problem that touches on all of these different communities, but just give consumers a right to repair their goods, give them access to the materials to do so, give independent repair providers access to those materials. That's what the New York Digital Fair Repair Act does. And we encourage you to pick up that law as well. I think that's it for me on this segment. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Pat to talk about digital ad taxes, and we'll move from there. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Lee. I've got one more for you before we start heading towards the finish line. It's taxing digital ad revenue, as Lee said. So big tech firms like Facebook, Google, and actually to a growing extent, Amazon, make their money selling ads. But those ad-based business models lead to a range of harms, such as, like we described before, Google self-preferencing. Because of the way it serves up ads, it has this incentive to keep you within Google's ecosystem and self-preference its own stuff. Or Facebook's algorithms leading to the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories because it can sell more ads against that kind of content because it's more clickbaity and terrible for the world. So you can tax this practice. You can tax the revenue that these large tech corporations make from their ad-based business models. Maryland passed a version of a digital ad tax that's currently in the courts. New Mexico is looking at using a regulatory process to get at it. There have been digital ad taxes introduced all across the country. I think this only really works in concert with some of the other things that we've talked about today. I don't think it is a solo solution to the problems of ad-based business models, because you couldn't really tax it at a high enough rate to actually make it go away because it's just so lucrative. But you could make a lot of money for the state on this really harmful practice and use that to provide the sort of services that state governments should be providing, supports to small businesses or whatever else, whatever sort of needs that the state has. So we think that's a good idea that's worth implementing alongside some of the other things that we've talked about today in the toolkit. And so I'm going to throw it back to Lee for one more plea for state lawmakers to do something to help their antitrust bureaus, and then we'll talk a little bit about what you all can do next.
Thanks so much, Pat. And this one really is basic. Give state enforcement authorities resources. If you pass a law and nobody enforces it, does the law really exist? Well, that's a question worth prying open and looking at. Here's some facts about this. Most states have fewer than 3 antitrust investigators on staff. 13 states have 0 antitrust investigators on staff. Just 6 states, California, New York, Florida, Texas, Washington, and Ohio, employ nearly half of all state-level antitrust lawyers. Assemblymember Kellis mentioned the importance of state attorneys general to actually do the work of enforcing these laws. And it's such a critical component of this. 2 days ago, we were joined by Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, who also spoke to the need for enforcement. And he made a good point, which is, you can hire an outside expert and pay them a ridiculous amount of money to tell you what you already know. Or you can have the staff that you funded through your budget process to do that work in-house. There's a lot of interesting history about this. One thing that I want to highlight is that back in the late 70s, Congress actually, in the context of the Criminal Code Reform Act, funded state attorney generals to do antitrust work, specifically earmarked for antitrust enforcement. And as federal antitrust enforcement waned in the following decades under the Reagan administration and beyond, what we actually saw as a result of the Criminal Code Reform Act from Congress is a spike in state-level enforcement. So state lawmakers can also push Congress to heed the call of 45 state attorneys general to provide federal funding for state antitrust efforts. And I'll just make one other pitch here. And I know we don't often talk about proverbial silver bullets for big issues, for complex issues, but antitrust policy is really close to that. Assemblymember Kellis mentioned Citizens United, which I think is something that has become part of the colloquial and generally understood vocabulary around politics. In a post-Citizens United world, if lawmakers and enforcement entities want to address corruption and the corrosive impact of corporate concentration on our communities, on working families, on small businesses, on our environment, on our day-to-day lives, antitrust is that. Invest in antitrust. Put your money into antitrust. Advocate for this in your budget cycles. So I just want to make that pitch at the end there. It's kind of a global pitch. It touches on everything that we're advocating for here in these workshops. And I'll turn it back to you, Pat.
Thank you so much, Lee, and thank you one more time to Assemblymember Kellis for being so excellent. We're so lucky to have her both here today, but far more importantly, leading the fight on the ground in a really important state. So what can you all do in our last 5 minutes here next to help advance the causes that we talked about here? The first thing you can do, go back and watch the rest of this series. We were very lucky to have Attorney General Ellison and Representative Morgan talk earlier this week, and to have Assemblymember Kellis speak today. Go back, watch those, listen to the policy ideas, see if anything piques your interest. And then step 2 is reach out to us, get in touch. If you're interested in taking this on in your state, we are more than happy to help. I'm going to volunteer Lee, and I think he'd be totally okay with this. If you are a state lawmaker or in an attorney general office and you want us to kick the tires on your state's antitrust laws, we are more than happy to do that and see what sort of ideas would help out and be useful, what sort of reforms would be good. But please reach out. I'm on email at pgarofalo@economicliberties.us. Lee is at lhepner@economicliberties.us. We're here to help if you're in a state house, if you're in a local business, if you're in an organization, or if you're just somebody who sees something bad happening in your community and you want to know what can be done at your city council, at your county commission, by contacting your AG or in your state house about it. Please reach out, get in touch with us. And one final ask is to help us identify lawmakers who will help with this. We have some pretty good friends around the country who I just talked about, but we'd love to have more. Our sister organization, Fight Corporate Monopolies, just launched a really important task force of state legislators who are committed to advancing these types of bills across the country. Assemblymember Kellis is on it, and we're really, really lucky to have her. But we'd love to hear about folks doing good work in this space who we haven't met yet, and to reach out and talk to them. So that was a lot of stuff. And yeah, hopefully we'll all be in touch soon. Thank you so much for being here today. We're really lucky to be getting to do all this work with all of you.